This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In both of this week's Top 10s, I'm going to be looking at instants. For every other card type, I've looked at the best and worst cards, so it's about time I do instants. Today, I'll be looking at the worst instants, and on Friday, I'll be looking at the best ones. Like all of my worst videos, this list is largely subjective. It's mostly based on my opinion about these cards. However, I do use some data to help inform my opinions. All of the cards on this list have never top 8'd any Premier event, and none of them see very much play in EDH. EDH is a wide open format where lots of niche cards that never found success anywhere else in Magic see play. So I think looking at the fact that a card has barely been played at all in EDH is a pretty good measurement of just how bad the card is. I used EDH Rec to come up with those numbers since it has data from over 122,000 decks. While I used that data to help me rank the cards, my opinion determined the rank of the cards first and foremost. For example, if a card was at least reasonable and limited, it didn't make the list, even if it isn't played much in EDH, because I wanted the instants that are bad in every single format they could be played in to be the ones on this list. Additionally, I did exclude two types of instants from this list: burn spells and counter spells. This is because I have already done worst videos on those, and I thought it would be fun to talk about some different terrible cards I haven't already discussed. Alright, let's get the list started. At number 10, I have Falling Timber. Fog effects are pretty bad most of the time, Turbo Fog decks notwithstanding. This is because you end up using a card to make no real impact on the board. Sure, maybe you just bought yourself a turn, but most of the time a fog isn't going to help you get out of the situation. It just delays the inevitable. So, you knew I had to include a fog on this list, and I went with my pick for the worst of them all, Falling Timber. Falling Timber isn't even really a full-blown fog effect because it only stops damage by one creature. Sure, sometimes that makes it better because you can triple block their creature and then use this and kill the creature in combat or whatever, but that's the ideal situation for the card, and paying 3 mana for that is pretty steep, especially because most of the time you won't even be able to set up that ideal situation. Most fogs only cost a single mana, and they stop all combat damage. That is just miles more efficient than this, even with the slight upside it has over a normal fog. And sure, it has kicker. That means you can do this twice in a turn or over a couple of turns in many cases, but this is still pretty terrible. It's highly situational, and even in Magical Christmas Land, it isn't a good card, just barely adequate. It has been played in 28 of the 120,000 decks on EDH Rec, and it pretty much only appears in Halar the Firefletcher decks that basically have to jam every single red or green card with kicker into their deck in order to take advantage of Halar. If I had done this list before Halar was printed, Falling Timber probably would have been in the single digits, but for now, Halar has saved it from being on the top part of this list. At number 9, I have Death of 1,000 Stings. This card is super flavorful, but it's also pretty bad, and it kind of has to be in order to be flavorful. 5 mana to drain 1 life from your opponent is just terrible, and yeah, it can come back from your graveyard if you have more cards in your hand than your opponent, sort of making it a really bad mana sink, but you still have to pay that 5 mana every single time, so it will take forever to kill your opponent. As the name of the card implies, the phrase Death of 1,000 Cuts has its origin in a torture method used throughout Asia where a knife was used to very slowly cut someone up. So, it makes sense that the stings here take their time in killing your opponent, but this list isn't about how flavorful cards are, it's about how bad they are, and Death of 1,000 Stings is horrible in terms of efficiency. To do 20 damage to your opponent with it, you have to invest 100 mana. That's pretty laughable, and that's why Death of 1,000 Stings sees very little play in EDH, and has never really been played anywhere else. In EDH, it is used in some graveyard-based decks, since you can get it back, but there are literally hundreds of other cards that can come back from the graveyard that people should be running instead of this. At number 8, it is Sacred Rites, which is part of a cycle of pretty terrible rites that appeared in Odyssey, with only the black one being a reasonable card. All of them have you discard cards to get some type of effect, and none of them, again except the black one, do enough to justify the huge cost of doing so. Sacred Rites is my pick for the worst card in a terrible cycle because boosting toughness is such a meaningless effect in most scenarios. Sure, you can use this to save your creature from a burn spell, but you have to 2-for-1 yourself to do it, and even then, you're only getting +0/+1 for paying the mana for this spell and discarding an extra card. That is awful. Maybe it helps you win combat, but because it only boosts toughness, there's no guarantee you'll actually kill one of your opponent's creatures. Even if you discard your whole hand to this, there's no guarantee that will happen. 21 decks are playing Sacred Rites and EDHREC, with Arcades the Strategist being the main home for the card, which kind of makes sense since Arcades is all about toughness, but I feel like there have to be some better ways to raise the toughness of your whole board than Sacred Rites. At number 7, it's Reign of Rust. The flexibility of this card might seem like it's kind of nice, but the mana cost makes the flexibility irrelevant. 5 mana to blow up an artifact or land, even at instant speed, is woefully inefficient, and just casting this in a game will often do enough to lose you the game because of the tempo loss. And sure, it comes with Entwine, so hey, you can pay 9 mana to blow up one of each. Yeah, that's still not very efficient. I mean, compare Reign of Rust with Pillage or even Demolish, and you'll see how horrible this card is. Sure, it's an instant, and they aren't, but I would gladly play a sorcery version of this effect that is far more efficient. Reign of Rust is played in a handful of decks on EDHREC that like to blow up lands, but like I keep saying about cards on this list, there are way better ways out there to blow up lands than running this useless piece of cardboard. At number 6, I have Fanatical Fever. You had to know a few combat tricks would make this list. Combat tricks have a hard time being good most of the time because they put you at a serious risk of getting 2-for-1. Your opponent can just blow up the creature you use it on, and that's absolutely devastating. What's more is they tend to be fairly situational for most decks. The board has to line up just right for casting a combat trick to be worth it, as they aren't usually worth using to just make a creature do more damage to your opponent for a turn unless they're dead from it. Normally, you want to be taking down an opponent's creature and keeping yours alive when you use them. There are, of course, decks out there that have really used tricks effectively, namely Infect, and some combat tricks do manage to find their way to success. But do you know how they do it? They are highly efficient and are worth the potential risk. Fanatical Fever is definitely not. +3/+0 and Trample for 4 mana is a terrible rate, and the more a trick costs, the more devastating it is when your opponent negates it, since you take a huge tempo hit. Yeah, Fanatical Fever is one of the worst combat tricks ever. However, I do think there are 2 that are even worse that will appear further up on this list, and one of them is our number 5 card, which is Barreling Attack. It has some striking similarities with Fanatical Fever. Both of them cost 4 mana and grant Trample, but Barreling Attack is even worse because it doesn't even always give you a stats boost. You only get that boost if the creature is blocked, and that means that Barreling Attack is even more situational than Fanatical Fever, since it will only be of use in that very specific situation. Something like Fanatical Fever can push through lethal sometimes. Barreling Attack will basically never do that, especially because the stats boost is so meager. At number 4, I have Wicked Reward, which I think is the worst combat trick ever, in addition to being the 4th worst instant. So, 2 mana to grant +4/+2 to a creature would not be worst instant or worst combat trick ever material, and would at least be okay in limited. But the additional cost here is very real. You have to give up another creature to get the boost in the first place. This means you are frequently going to be starting off with a 2-for-1, and you may potentially get 3-for-1 if your stats boost doesn't actually help your creature survive somehow. And sure, it's an instant after all, so you can do this in response to your opponent casting a removal spell on one of your creatures and then sacrifice that creature, but this stats boost is going to be utterly useless in so many scenarios that you're still going to be 2-for-1ing yourself. And yeah, if you sacrifice a creature token, it doesn't hurt too much, but I think a lot of the time, you'd rather just have that token. There's a reason this is only in 6 decks on EDHREC, and 6 is actually pretty generous. The number should really be 0, and really that's true of the top 4 cards on this list. At number 3, it's Mungaras Blessing. Cards that gain life and don't do anything else tend to be bad, and there are several instances out there that do this, and all of them were candidates to make the list, but in the end I decided Mungaras Blessing was the worst of the bunch. Cards like this are bad for the same reason that fogs are bad. They lead to you using up the valuable resource of a card and not actually impacting the board at all, which is key in 99% of games. 3 mana to gain 5 life isn't even an efficient deal either. If you're really into playing cards that do nothing but gain you life, you could at least go for a more efficient one. And yeah, I know the discard clause here gives it some interesting upside, gaining you 2 life for free and returning to your hand, but that's just not going to come up very often, and even when it does come up, you're not really going to be doing anything super impressive that makes it harder for your opponent to win the game. Sure, you get a card back, but it's a card that basically does nothing, so you may as well not get it back in the first place. At number 2, I have Malicious Advice. Of all the cards on this list, Malicious Advice is probably the one that can actually make the biggest impact on a game in an ideal situation. Tapping down a bunch of stuff is very real, but only in the right situation. And the price Malicious Advice asks for is completely insane. Not only do you have to have 2 colors of mana and pay a mana for every single creature, artifact, or land you tap down, you also have to pay life. If it only had you pay mana, it still wouldn't be especially good, but it probably would have avoided this list. There are just so many better ways to tap down your opponent's board that are more efficient and don't require you to pay a ton of life, and for that reason, almost no one plays Malicious Advice in EDH or anywhere else. And at number 1, I have Break Open. A lot of the cards we've looked at thus far are bad because they basically do nothing or do something extremely inefficiently. Break Open is worse than all of them because almost all it can do is actively help your opponent. Break Open lets you turn face-down creatures face-up, but only your opponent's face-down creatures. There's almost no reason you would ever want to do that. This is because the majority of morph creatures are scarier than the vanilla 3-mana 2/2 that they are when they are face down, so turning it face up is just giving your opponent the face down creature they already probably wanted, and they get it for free. And actually better than free, you also have to spend 2 mana on it. What's worse is, many morph creatures also do something immediately when they turn face up, and your opponent is also going to be getting that trigger at an incredible discount. It appears in 14 decks on EDH Rec, but they seem to all be Zedru decks that are very much focused on doing group hug type things. In other words, the plan there is to use Break Open to help out another player in the first place. But even in a deck like that, I feel like running Break Open is unwise because it isn't like morphs are so numerous that every single deck has them. It's just going to be a dead card a lot of the time. So, those are my picks for the worst instance in the entire history of the game, with Break Open my pick for number 1. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to see the other MTG top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. And if you want to make sure you catch future MTG top 10s, like the video on the best instance in the whole game on Friday, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.